Wow. Good evening. Caroline, thank you for that beautiful introduction. Wow. Caroline is an ambassador, a lawyer, an author, a philanthropist, and a mom of 3 accomplished kids. She has a hot husband. She can also bake a really good chocolate cake. And you may be wondering, how can I be friends with someone like this? And I have only one reply for you. I am not a snob. No matter what you may think of me. Actually, I think Carolyn and I are friends because we really do love candy. It's one of those things that we really have an intense love for. On February 7th, 2017, my second novel, Pachinko, was published by Grand Central, an imprint of Hachette Book Group. And they're here tonight, and I want to thank them for supporting my work and our story. When the book came out, my brilliant agent, Suzanne Gluck, who's also here, gave me some advice regarding book promotion and the book tour. She said, don't come home. Stay on the road. So more or less, for the past 3 years, when I wasn't researching, writing, or teaching, I was on the road. I did not come home. And consequently, I have done several hundred public events around the world. My family's not clapping. A book tour is a very weird thing. And it is especially strange for an introvert who routinely experiences both profound shame and a fear of failure. And at each public event, I worry about disappointing my publisher, my editor, my publicist, my agent, my friends, my family, and every single Korean in the world. I'm in therapy. I suffer from an absurd affliction of insecurity and grandiosity in equal measure, framed by a thick layer of personal shame. And somehow, I believe that my efforts are just not enough. So I work and I work. I'm also a Presbyterian. I'm also really emotional. So at public events, when I'm moved, I cry. And any of you who have been to some of my events have seen me lose my very thin veneer of composure. And this is after decades of seeing Dr. Kellerman. Now, who shows up? Who shows up to my public events? Well, I've had events as few as 2 people in my audience, one of whom was my husband's cousin. No, this is true. It happened in Madison, Wisconsin. I'm still not over it. And I have spoken to audiences in places like Buffalo and Sydney, Australia, which have numbered in the thousands. And as an author, I am very fortunate enough to know who reads my books, because I have many of my readers. And in general, the overwhelming majority of the folks, the overwhelming majority of the people who have read my books are actually not Korean. In this past year, I did a sold-out event at Carnegie Hall in Pittsburgh, which seats 1,900 people, and about 50 were Asian American. I'm telling you this for a weird reason. In Maine, an elderly white man came up to me after an event, after reading Free Food for Millionaires. And he told me, "I am Casey Han, the daughter of Korean immigrants who run a dry cleaning business. Readers from Iran and Afghanistan and Germany have told me that pachinko is their story. It's both humbling and deeply gratifying, and that said, since I have decided, not that anyone has asked me, but I have decided that it's my personal mission to humanize Koreans through literature. I think it's not necessarily a bad thing if non-Koreans can believe that our stories can be their stories. So as you know, I write about Koreans, and I write fiction that is heavily researched. I read an inordinate amount of scholarship and do a lot of field work, and this might be a way of avoiding writing, or it might be a way for me to feel more confident in my work. Either way, I have now interviewed thousands of Koreans around the world, so I can report with great authority that we are infinitely diverse and a very complex people. Having said that, lately I have been seeing a little change in my events. More and more Koreans are coming to my events. So I thought I would tell you about the two types of Koreans who have made a very lasting impression on me every time they show up. Now, the first type of Korean who shows up is usually a baby boomer, Korean American man. And he is a first generation, very scholarly type of person. And he will be sitting in the first or second row. His arms will be folded like this. And he is usually wearing a vest. Because Koreans like vests. And while I'm reading from my book or having a conversation with a moderator, I will notice this man and he will be studying me like I am a bacterial specimen on a slide. And by the way, I am always nervous speaking in public. I am terrified right now. But under his watchful gaze, I am a fucking wreck. Then after the event, this gentleman will march up to me and he will wave a well-thumbed copy of Pachinko or Free Food for Millionaires. And he will say, "I didn't buy this." And I shrug, feeling the full measure of shame at having written a book that he doesn't think is worth buying. My American patient gave it to me. She told me I had to read it. And I nod because I don't know what else to do. "I read it," he'll say. And I hang my head. "I came tonight because I wanted to see who you are. I'm very busy. I don't normally have time to go to bookstore readings." And I look up, and then it occurs to me that this man reminds me of my grandfather, who died when I was 20. So in my mind, I stop being 51 years old, and then I become somebody much younger. And I find myself bowing a little bit, like I'm a college student, and I say, "Thank you for coming. Would you like me to sign your book?" and he'll say, That's Korean for yes. And I sign the book for him, and I write these words. And these are the words that I often write when you come to one of my events. I write, "We are family." And I write this because this is something I want my readers to know, that we are deeply connected as human beings. And as he reads this, he looks at me and says, finally, the book was good. And then, right before I have the chance to speak, he will turn around and walk out of the bookstore. And I will turn to the next person on the signing line. However, for the rest of the evening, I will think of this man because I know from having met so many Koreans that it took a great deal for him to show up to a reading. And I know he has worked very hard in his life, often alone, often obscure, and often misunderstood by his American peers. And he has never been praised sufficiently for all that he has done. And I know that his patient gave him a book because patients give presents to their doctors who are good doctors. And I want him to know that though he is not my doctor, I value his work too. The other kind of Korean American who shows up to my events is usually a little younger, anywhere from 16 years old to about 35. I get both young men and young women, and with them I am less afraid because I'm a college professor. So I feel comfortable with my young people. And the young Korean will always rush up to me and he will say some variation of the following things. When I read your book, I started to understand my father. After I read your book, I called my grandmother and asked her questions that I had never asked her before. And after I read your book, I became proud of my history. And no matter how long the signing line is, this is what I usually say. Do you know why I wrote these books? And the young man will ask me, why? I wrote it because I think we're fascinating. And he will look at me, puzzled, like I'm speaking Latin. And I tell him, I believe we are heroic, tragic, romantic, long-suffering, and I believe we are powerful. I tell him this because I want to bless him, even if the Western world says Asians are like machines, robotic and inscrutable, and like machinery, we should remain invisible. Dude, I say, you and I are nothing short of epic. And maybe he thinks I'm crazy. But at that point, I can't stop myself. So I speak to this young man as if he is my only son. And so I ask him, do you know for whom I wrote these books? And he will shake his head And then I say, I wrote it for you. I wrote it for us. And I'm glad you are here because it means so much to me. And it does, and this does. Now, why are we here tonight? It certainly cannot be to honor two Ajamas. Although Juju is very worthy. Earlier this month, about 10 days ago, I had the opportunity to visit the CIDA, C-I-D-A, which stands for Community Inclusion and Development Alliance. One of the organizations that KACF supports in Bayside, New York. CIDA is a nonprofit organization that supports individuals with severe disabilities and their families through advocacy, social services, self-determination, training, and much, much needed regular support. And on the day that I visited, the founder, Dr. Bae, was running a workshop for parents of adult children with disabilities. The CIDA office, I want you to imagine, is about 1,000 square feet. It's divided into two smaller rooms, and there's a modest open space for meetings. And that day, in the meeting area, there were 18 mothers whose children had disabilities ranging in autism, blindness, Down syndrome, severe learning issues, and cerebral palsy. And they were gathered to learn, to share information, and to support each other. 2 long conference tables were stacked lengthwise, and each seat was taken. And the mothers ranged from the ages of 40 to 65. The women work in delis, dry cleaners, restaurants, medical offices, and family-owned businesses. A few mothers wore makeup and had nicer office clothes. But for the most part, the mothers were working-class immigrants, and every one of the mothers looked exhausted. Many had wrinkles and age spots. They dyed their hair at home if they dyed it at all, and you can see the white roots. Everything about their dress reflected practical concerns. They wore clothing to reflect the weather and the nature of their work. Uniqlo down jackets, generic sweaters, and pants with elastic waists. These women were not friends, but they were not strangers to each other. These mothers were connected with each other as fellow travelers with a profound sense of purpose in the critical mission for their next generation. The workshop was conducted in Korean, the native language of these mothers, and soon it became a kind of alphabet soup of English acronyms specific to the world of disabilities. DAC, IEP, OTP, DAP, SSI, FND, ETP, OPW, CD, EMH, CPDB, and many, many more. As a person who has gone to law school, I could barely keep up with the amount of material that these mothers would have to understand in their second language. When the mothers were able to ask questions, I strained to hear their voices. These were women who did not work in boardrooms. They were not used to talking over anyone else. They were quiet and they were frightened. Nevertheless, they overcame their private nature. They wanted to know if it would be possible to get a transportation voucher when they travel from Queens to Manhattan for their child with a wheelchair. They wanted to know about work training for their children. One mother talked about traveling for 5 hours round trip just so that her son with disabilities could work for 5. And she was very proud of her son because he could be a contributing person in our society. They wanted to know what the siblings without disabilities could do for their siblings with disabilities. And the mothers wanted to know what would happen to their children when they could no longer take care of them. In these women's faces, foreheads deeply lined, brows furrowed with V's, and cheeks sprayed with freckles, with most not wearing a drop of makeup, you could see their profound worry, their fear for the future, and their immense love. And as I sat in the back of the room in my folding chair, I witnessed how the Korean American Community Foundation was supporting this grantee partner, and I felt some measure of consolation that these mothers do not have to face the long road alone and friendless in America. And after the meeting, I had the chance to speak with the founder, Dr. Bae, a very elegant woman, a mother of 2 young men. She has a doctorate in special education from Teachers College at Columbia University. And Dr. Bae also has 1 adult son with autism. CIDA for her grew out of informal coffee meetings using shared email lists of mothers of children with disabilities who wanted to know how to help their sons and daughters. The organization is only 3 years old, and it has become nimble and effective primarily due to the vision and efforts of Dr. Bae and her team, but also because KACF is a mentoring grantee partner that takes the long view on growing our larger community. Before I left the CIDA offices, I asked Dr. Bae, what could we do to help? And she said to me, well, of course, financial support is helpful. But the thing that we ask from our Korean community is if you could include our children. 끼워 주세요. Please include our children. So some of us here, thank you. Some of us here have children, and some of us do not. However, all of us are sons and daughters. And certainly, as newer Americans, we can remember what it felt like to be rejected, dismissed, and hated. And we can recall what it meant for us to be accepted, respected, and loved. Well, how can we include the children? We can invite the children to parties, to play dates, to our homes, our churches, and workplaces. We can hire young people with disabilities and make accommodations for families with different needs. We can see that our family is growing, inclusive, and more powerful because we care about each other and we care about our collective culture. Kyung, our dear friend and our tireless leader, told me last night that every table was sold tonight. How remarkable is that? And again, I thank you for supporting KACF. This room tonight is filled with very, very special people. And I am deeply honored to be included in your number. But this room is also filled with people who have not always been invited to every table or to every room. I know, because I know what it's like not to have been included. And sometimes every seat at the table is already taken. And sometimes the table is too small. And sometimes our invitations get lost in the mail. And at such times, I remember Shirley Chisholm, the daughter of West Indian immigrants who served as a US Congresswoman for 14 years and was the first Black candidate to run for a major party's nomination for President of the United States. She was a native New Yorker and she was not invited to many events or places. And Congresswoman Chisholm said, "When they don't give you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair." So, if there are many, many types of Koreans, what type of Korean are we? Surely, from looking at this crowd, we are among the very fortunate kind. And tonight, we, the very fortunate, are doing what young people today call flexing. We are flexing our social power. We are flexing our economic power, and we are flexing our creative power, and we are flexing our professional power. But above all, what will truly make us truly fortunate people is if we flex our compassion. And I hope that tonight, and for the rest of our lives, we can flex our strongest muscles, because we will need them so we can carry as many folding chairs as we can for all of our brothers and sisters. I thank you, I thank my family, but I thank you, my larger family, for being so committed to taking care of our group and our growing America. Thank you.